A changing economy. The early 1900s saw enormous changes in Canada's economy. Many of these changes set the stage for economic developments throughout the 20th century. Natural resources and foreign trade continued to be important parts of the Canadian economy. The economy also shifted to include a stronger manufacturing base.
The capitalist system was developing in Canada. Capitalists invested money in the means of production, factories, raw material, and labor and force. These capitalists make decisions about products, volume of production, and selling price based on the demands of consumers. Capitalism was rising, changing, and contrasting with the early farmer-based economy. More people moved to urban areas, and as transportation of goods improved, fewer people were self-sufficient. New things began to appear on the market, such as household appliances, farming machines, and automobiles. Mass-produced factories were eagerly produced by consumers. These changes in the economy influenced workers. Since products were no longer being handmade, instead produced by factories, Canadian workers joined unions or formed new ones to protect their wages, safety, and working conditions.
Industries that gather natural or raw materials like agriculture products, trees, minerals, and fish are called primary industries. In the early years of the 20th century, Canada, which had always relied on primary industries, began to develop its natural resources on a larger scale. Large-scale production and exports of huge quantities of products such as wheat became an important part of Canada's economy in these years. Canada's mining industry also grew rapidly. In southern British Columbia, copper, silver, lead, zinc, and gold were mined. In northern Ontario, gold and other metals were found and developed. Prospectors and investors rushed to northern Ontario by the thousands after silver was discovered in coal belts. At this time, coal mining became an important part of the economies of Nova Scotia and Alberta. Canada's forests were also being harvested to meet the growing international demand for lumber, pulp, and paper. Secondary industries, often called as manufacturing industries, are industries that produce finished products from primary goods, for example, furniture from lumber. Before 1900, most of the country's wealth depended on primary industries, especially farming. In the 20th century, rapid population growth increased consumer demand for manufactured goods. New factories and more tractors and threshing machines were made for the new farms. For most of the 20th century, economists divided the economy into three sectors. As well as primary and secondary industries, there were tertiary industries. Tertiary industries include financial services, clerical services, trade, transportation, utilities, and public administration. New technology also played an important role in the development of industries in the early 20th century. Refrigerated railway boxcars, telephones, typewriters, steam-deriving engines, new mining technologies, and electrical power all helped to fuel the industrial boom. Labor-saving machines made work easier, faster, or required fewer people to do the work. Electricity brought in new and faster ways to make pulp and paper, sew clothes, and grind wheat into flour. In the cities, new machines run by steam or electricity were replacing skilled workers.
Max Aitken, the son of a churchman, was born in Ontario in 1879. He grew up in New Brunswick. As a young man, in the first year of the 20th century, he rose very quickly in the world of business. While still in his 20s, he became a millionaire director of Royal Securities, advising banks and wealthy investors. His greatest business talent, however, was merging companies into large corporations, making them even more efficient. For example, in 1909, he oversaw the consolidation of 9 cement firms, 5 in Ontario, 3 in Quebec, and 1 in Alberta. He also helped create and headed up the Canadian Railway Car and Foundry Company and the Steel Company of Canada. During World War I, the cost of living in Canada had increased steadily, but wages did not, which resulted for Canadians to growing poor. After the war, even more Canadians fell into an economic slump. Industries that developed weaponry for the war had to change their products to peacetime production and caused people to be thrown out of work. As Europe began growing wheat again, Canada's farmers lost many of the overseas market that they gave during the war. The government removed price controls in the later years to prevent the price of manufacturing goods such as tractors from getting higher, as the government removed price controls in the later years to prevent the price of manufacturing goods such as tractors getting higher. As a result, price rose and farmers had to pay increasingly high prices for goods and equipment. Canada's national growth product had more than doubled during the war. Average wages, working savings, and tax revenues increased. War costs were high, yet after the war, Ottawa was able to pay Britain $2 billion to help recover their economy. Canada was also one of the few countries who was able to produce exports for the American market. If you had lived in Canada in the early 1970s, you would have seen clear signs of prosperity. Houses and apartments were built in the ground cities and suburbs. Most of Canadian families had a second car, television, or telephone. Many Canadians also had money to spend on travel and other forms of leisure, fast food, and consumer goods. A few wealthy Canadians had enough capital to establish new professional sport franchises. Among the new hockey teams were the Calgary Flames, the Edmonton Oilers, Vancouver Canucks, and Winnipeg Jets. Two Canadian Major League Baseball teams, the Montreal Expos 1969 and Toronto Blue Jays, were also established. Devastation in the West. Prairie farmers were among the Canadians hardest during the Great Depression. Rapidly rising wheat prices in the 1920s had drawn many settlers to the West. Many of them used farming methods that produced wheat but quickly robbed the soil of nutrients needed to grow the following year's crops. As early as the mid-1920s, many farmers in the dry belt had begun to suffer from crop failure as overworked soil dries out. Many farmers had settled into the Palliser Triangle, a farming area near the American border, mainly in southern Saskatchewan but including parts of Alberta. By 1926, the heart of the Palliser Triangle in Alberta had already held 6,460 vacant or abandoned farms, spreading all over close to 6,500,000. Although many farmers in the prairies were already suffering in the 1920s, in the 1930s, economic and nature combined to devastate the lives of thousands or more farmers. The collapse of wheat prices was the first blow. Since many wheat farmers had to invest in expensive machinery in the 1920s, they had little cash to fall back on. Some farmers had to borrow money to purchase their equipment. Because they were now unable to pay back their loans, many had to declare bankruptcy. Wheat production fell dramatically, not because of bankruptcy, but also because of a series of natural disasters. Summer droughts combined with high winds to create huge dust storms, sometimes so severe that they literally blew away farms, and caused the CPR to use snowplows on their trains in the summer. Yet another disaster came in form of clouds of grasshoppers that destroyed wheat fields in minutes. The first swarm appeared in 1931 to 1932. The infestation continued throughout the decade, and some Canadians afterwards called it the Dirty 30s. Prairie farmers and their families were so badly hit by the Great Depression that many of them left the West. Besides 1931 and 1937, more than 1,200,000 immigrated to other parts of Canada to the United States.
Hard times for Canadians. Canada has never experienced an economic crash as severe as the Great Depression of the 1930s. In 1930 and 31, many experts and ordinary Canadians too expected that the economy would pick up. Yet instead of reviving, conditions worsened in the cities. Any family member who could not get work did so. Sometimes young people had to quit school to earn a few dollars. Families cut expenditures to a bare minimum, with almost all income going towards food, rent, or mortgages. There was no money to spend on luxuries. In the countryside, farmers could not survive on what they grew, if they had mixed crop farms or market gardens. For example, many natives living on reserves were also able to live off the land. Staple crop farmers, especially the wheat farmers of the prairies, were not able to do so. During the war, the federal government continued in its regular roles, but it had the added burden of coordinating and financing the war effort. Early in August 1914, in preparation for the war, the Canadian government passed the War Measures Act. The act gave the government control over many areas of life in Canada. People suspected of being enemies of the state, such as enemy aliens, could be arrested and detained without the usual protection of the law. The government could also use the War Measures Act to detect to farmers and factory owners what to produce for the war effort. The cost of the war soon rose to about $1 million a day. To help finance the war, the government in 1917 placed special taxes on businesses. and for the first time, just for the duration of the war, levied personal income taxes on individual. Temporary taxes were also introduced on coffee, tobacco, and cars. As you know, these temporary taxes became permanent. Ordinary citizens, too, worked to raise money for the war. Victory loan campaigns were aimed at getting financial support from people with small incomes. People also donated to a number of patriotic funds. From 1925 until the end of the decade, Canadian wheat farmers grew record quantities of crop and sold them for record prices. In 1929, however, not all the 1928 wheat crops grown by Canadian farmers could be sold. The United States, Australia, and Argentina had also enjoyed record wheat crops, so competition for market was heavy. In response to the large amount of unsold wheat, Canadian wheat prices began to fall. Wheat production was a symbol of how dependent Canadians were on a staple-based economy and on the ups and downs for the economies of other nations. Like most of Canada's staple products, natural or resource products such as crop timber and minerals, Canadian grain was an export crop. Most of it was sold outside Canada, mainly to the United States and overseas. Any decline in foreign economies, many of which were still recovering from the First World War, could hurt Canada's economy.